10 years ago, the world rolled its eyes when China started burying straw in deserts. Experts laughed. Headlines mocked it. You can't grow trees in sand, they said. But today, engineers are flying in from the US, not to inspect failure, but to study success. What changed? Everything. And what they found stunned even the harshest critics. This is the story of how one of the world's driest places became a green blueprint for saving the planet. It's not science fiction, it's China's green miracle, and it's very, very real. The laugh heard around the world. When China first announced its plan to plant forests in its vast deserts, the reaction from the world was almost unanimous. Laughter. Scientists scoffed, engineers rolled their eyes, and journalists called it a waste of time and money. Many said it was just another example of a government trying to impress with flashy ideas that would never work. After all, how could you possibly grow trees in the desert? At the heart of the skepticism was the assumption that nature couldn't be tamed. People remembered the stories of failed afforestation projects from other parts of the world. They pointed at the harsh conditions of the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts and asked, who in their right mind thinks trees will grow there? International media labeled it a joke. Headlines mocked the project, with phrases like burying money in sand becoming common catchphrases. US engineers in particular were quick to criticize. Experts pointed out the lack of water, extreme temperatures, and high wind speeds. They claimed the initiative had no scientific foundation. Even environmentalists doubted it, warning that monoculture plantations could damage the fragile desert ecosystem rather than heal it. It's like trying to build a castle out of smoke. One American desert ecologist was quoted saying, "But while the world ridiculed, China kept working. Quietly, steadily, they moved forward with a plan that wasn't just about planting trees, but about reshaping entire landscapes." What people didn't realize then was that this wasn't just a green PR stunt. It was a serious response to an urgent national crisis. While critics were busy mocking China's green dream, a different story was unfolding on the ground. The effort wasn't born from ambition. It was born from desperation. Entire communities were being buried under sand, and people were fleeing their homes. What looked like an impossible idea was actually a lifeline. Before the trees came the tragedy that made them necessary. The crisis that sparked a green dream. Long before the planning began, China was facing a growing disaster. Its deserts were spreading fast, the Gobi alone expanding by more than 3,000 square kilometers every year. Entire villages were getting buried. Crops were failing. Dust storms were so powerful that they darkened the skies in cities hundreds of miles away. People started calling it the silent killer. The roots of the crisis were deep. Decades of overgrazing, deforestation, and poor farming methods had stripped the land of its natural defenses. Without vegetation, the soil dried up and the wind carried it away. The damage was so severe that by the early 2000s, more than 25% of China's land had become desert. That's over 2.6 million square kilometers, an area nearly the size of Argentina. But this wasn't just about the environment, it was a threat to China's economy, food supply, and even national stability. Around 400 million people lived in or near these damaged zones. Entire communities had to be moved. China even became one of the only countries in the world with ecological migrants, people forced to leave their homes because the land itself had died. This growing emergency demanded more than just quick fixes. Leaders realized that if they didn't act fast, parts of northern China could become completely unlivable. That's when the idea of the Great Green Wall started to gain momentum. A project so big, so bold, that it seemed like science fiction. Out of crisis came clarity. China realized it had no choice but to think big. The desert was not going to stop unless something massive was done. And so the seeds of the Great Green Wall were planted, not just in the ground, but in the minds of those ready to fight back. What came next would be one of the boldest moves in ecological history. China's Great Green Wall was born. In 1978, China launched what would become the largest ecological project in human history, The 3 North Shelter Forest Program, better known as the Great Green Wall, it was a massive undertaking. The goal was to plant a wall of trees stretching over 4,500 kilometers across the north of China, covering 87 million acres of land. This wasn't a short-term campaign. It was designed to roll out in 8 phases over 73 years, ending in 2050. The mission was clear: stop the desert from spreading, restore the land, and protect the people. It was an all-hands-on-deck effort. Local governments were ordered to participate, and farmers were offered incentives to turn damaged farmland back into forest. Tree planting became a patriotic duty. In 1981, China introduced National Tree Planting Day on March 12th. Schools, companies, and even military units got involved. Between 1982 and 2021, Chinese citizens planted an estimated 78.1 billion trees. The campaign became deeply rooted in Chinese identity. "We plant trees not just for ourselves, but for the future," said one volunteer in Inner Mongolia. But this wasn't just about planting trees. Scientists began researching which species could survive in dry conditions. They tested different planting techniques and even started tracking progress with satellites. It was a mix of tradition and technology, policy and passion. And despite the early failures, green patches began to appear where there was once only sand. It started to work, but just barely. For every patch of green, there were hundreds of trees that didn't make it. The effort was massive, but so was the failure rate. As trees wilted and critics sharpened their pens again, China stood at a crossroads. Would they give up, or would they double down with smarter solutions and deeper resolve? The straw that anchored the desert. The solution didn't come from satellites or supercomputers. It came from straw. In the early stages of fighting the desert, Chinese scientists developed a method that was as simple as it was genius: straw checkerboards. These were square grids of dried rice straw laid out in 1 by 1 meter plots across the sand. At first glance, it looked like a strange art installation, but its purpose was powerful: stop the sand from moving. When sand moves freely, it buries anything that tries to grow. The checkerboards worked by reducing wind speed at ground level, holding the sand in place. This gave the desert surface a chance to breathe, absorb moisture, and let seeds settle somewhere. Rice straw, a byproduct of China's huge rice industry, suddenly became a vital resource. Tons of what was once considered waste were transported deep into the desert each year. These straw grids didn't just stop sand, they made planting possible. They helped trap dew, hold in nutrients, and gave tree roots a better chance to grow. In early pilot zones, scientists recorded a 99% drop in sand movement. It was an incredible number, and the method didn't require high-tech gear or chemicals, just hard work, coordination, and patience. Villages, workers, and volunteers worked together to lay down straw by hand. This method became the backbone of the first wave of China's desert transformation. In places where no green had grown in decades, tiny patches of life started to appear. Over time, those patches grew into corridors. Corridors turned into belts, and belts began forming shields against advancing dunes. As one desert researcher put it, we weren't planting trees, we were building armor. And that armor would buy them the time they needed to go further. But while the checkerboards were starting to work, the rest of the world wasn't impressed. In fact, they were laughing. News outlets mocked the idea, scientists scoffed, and many people believed China was simply throwing effort and money into the sand. What came next wasn't progress. It was mockery, setbacks, and a storm of criticism that tested everything the country had started. Mockery and missteps. As China laid straw and planted trees in its deserts, the world looked on with doubt, and often open ridicule. Environmental experts from abroad called the efforts naive. Some even described it as burying money in the sand. Headlines questioned why anyone would think it possible to grow forests in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And truth be told, the early results gave skeptics plenty of ammunition. Many of the first trees planted didn't survive. In some regions, up to 85% of saplings died within the first year. These failures weren't just from drought. China was using tree species like poplar and pine, which weren't suited for desert life. Without deep roots or resistance to heat and wind, They stood little chance. Massive plantations turned into ghost groves. Rows of dead, brittle trees stretched across the dunes like lost hopes. Environmental scientists criticized the strategy as rushed and unbalanced. Monoculture forests, they warned, could damage the soil even more over time. They said China was trading one problem for another. International media joined the chorus, publishing images of failed planting zones and labeling the whole campaign green theater. At one point, the phrase "burying dreams in the desert" became a running joke in scientific circles. Even within China, confidence started to slip. Some government scientists began urging a pause. They called for a shift from just planting trees to restoring ecosystems more naturally. Still, China refused to back down. The missteps were real, but so was the determination. Behind closed doors, teams of researchers were already planning the next stage. Smarter strategies, new technologies, and native species that might actually survive. The mockery didn't stop them. It refined them. Out of the setbacks came a moment of realization. Brute force wouldn't conquer the desert. Something had to change. If trees couldn't survive, the approach had to. And so began China's pivot to innovation, where science, engineering, and traditional wisdom merged to build not just forests, but entire self-sustaining ecosystems. Engineering a new desert strategy. By the mid-2000s, China realized it needed to do more than plant trees. It had to rethink the entire approach to fighting the desert. This time, the mission wasn't just about planting more. It was about planting smarter. The country turned to engineers, scientists, and ecologists to create strategies that could truly work in the long run. The result was a shift from volume to survivability, and it changed everything. One major leap came from automating the straw checkerboards. Previously laid by hand, the process was slow and exhausting. Engineers designed machines that could lay straw grids 4 to 6 times faster than human workers. This allowed China to expand desert stabilization efforts rapidly, without overwhelming human labor. Soon, large portions of desert could be stabilized in a matter of days, not months. The second breakthrough came from the plants themselves. Instead of trying to force non-native trees into alien soil, scientists focused on native desert species, like saxaul, tamarisk, and goji berry. These plants had evolved to survive droughts, winds, and extreme temperatures. They didn't just survive, they thrived, and their deep roots helped lock in soil, slowing erosion and improving water retention in the sand. China also invested heavily in soil and water innovation. Biochar, compost, and special fungi were used to help plants absorb nutrients more efficiently. Drip irrigation systems were introduced in pilot zones to conserve water. Meanwhile, drones and satellites were deployed to monitor progress in real time. If an area was failing, scientists could adjust tactics immediately instead of waiting for seasonal data. The results of this strategy shift were dramatic. Forests stopped dying, plants began to grow in self-sustaining clusters. New methods were tested across railways, roads, and villages, protecting infrastructure from the ever-moving dunes. As one engineer said, "We stopped fighting the desert and started designing with it." What began as a war had become a collaboration, and the desert was finally starting to respond. With this new wave of smart engineering, something incredible started to happen. For the first time in decades, the desert began to bloom. Green corridors stretched across sandscapes once considered lifeless. And as China pushed forward, the rest of the world started to look again, not with laughter, but with genuine awe. 10 years later, they regretted it. A decade after China began laying straw and planting trees in the heart of its deserts, something unimaginable began to unfold. The same areas once labeled hopeless wastelands were now showing signs of life, real, sustainable, and measurable. In 2024, China reached a major milestone. A 3,000-kilometer-long greenbelt had successfully encircled the Taklamakan Desert. This wasn't just a symbolic win, it was a dramatic shift in reality. The satellite images told the story better than words ever could. Aerial photography that once showed vast gray dunes now displayed green arcs and ribbons. Areas where sandstorms once rolled, like angry waves, had stabilized. Whole regions reported massive drops in storm activity. Inner Mongolia, once plagued by choking yellow clouds, now enjoyed cleaner skies. In the cities, people began noticing less dust in the air, healthier crops, and clearer views of the horizon. Infrastructure that had once been vulnerable now stood protected. The BTU Lanzhou Railway, once forecast to be swallowed by sand, was still fully operational, guarded by rows of native plants and checkerboard barriers. Highways through the desert, once ridiculed as vanity projects, were now lifelines through stable corridors. These projects became not just signs of victory, but evidence that China's hybrid methods, machine, human, and ecological, were working. And then came the human benefit. Ecotourism began to rise. Formerly unlivable areas were now centers for agriculture, with crops like goji berries and desert grapes being cultivated. Thousands of jobs were created in regions once marked for abandonment. They said it was impossible, said one local farmer in Gansu. Now our children can stay here instead of leaving. The global response shifted from mockery to curiosity. Experts who once scoffed now asked for blueprints. How did a plan so widely doubted become a model of success? That curiosity sparked a ripple effect around the world, one that would turn China's once mocked campaign into a blueprint for global transformation. A global model of transformation. What began as a desperate national effort soon evolved into a global environmental case study. As China's deserts turned green, so too did perceptions. NASA satellite data confirmed the visual change. From 2000 to 2017, China contributed over 25% of the world's total net increase in leaf area. It wasn't theory, it was happening, and the numbers backed it up. Environmental scientists started referring to the Great Green Wall as the largest human-made ecological shift in history. Nations that once laughed began to listen. Countries in the Sahel region of Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East began consulting with Chinese engineers and ecologists. China's simple yet scalable ideas, like straw checkerboards and native planting, were suddenly being tested abroad. One of the most remarkable things about China's desertification strategy was its accessibility. They didn't rely on billion-dollar tech or exclusive knowledge. Instead, they used materials many countries already had: agricultural waste, local labor, native species, community involvement, government coordination, and adaptive innovation were the key pillars. And they could be replicated almost anywhere. China even partnered with Africa's own Great Green Wall Initiative, contributing both funding and expertise. As sand continued to swallow lands in Niger, Mali, and Sudan, Chinese soil scientists worked alongside local farmers as to adapt strategies to new climates. It's not about exporting Chinese methods, said one expert. It's about sharing what's been learned through failure and success. Still, success wasn't just about planting trees or exporting techniques. It was also about how China redefined its relationship with nature, with tradition, and with modern science. And that blend of wisdom, data, and humility became the secret to surviving the harshest terrains on Earth. Blending tradition, tech, and nature. In the later stages of the campaign, China embraced a new mindset. It stopped seeing the desert as an enemy to defeat and began treating it as a system to understand. This shift unlocked some of the most creative solutions in modern environmental history. At its heart was the blending of ancient practices with cutting-edge tech. Traditional knowledge played a huge role. Local nomadic tribes had for centuries survived in the fringes of deserts, growing tough crops and using water wisely. China tapped into this knowledge, combining it with modern environmental engineering. For instance, ancient clay pot irrigation was revived, modified with drip systems controlled by satellite weather forecasting. Technology became an ally, not a replacement. Drones flew over the dunes to track moisture levels. AI models predicted which plants would thrive in specific microclimates. Ground sensors monitored soil conditions in real time. Instead of guessing, China began tailoring every planting strategy to the land's unique behavior. It was like listening to the land instead of yelling at it, said one desert engineer. This approach birthed a new field: desert ecosystem design. Not just planting trees, but building mini biomes, Shrubs, grasses, and native herbs worked in harmony to support small animals, insects, and birds. These weren't forests in the traditional sense, but functioning ecosystems that were self-sustaining. That complexity, once seen as unnecessary, became the key to long-term survival. As these systems began to stabilize and flourish, a new kind of excitement took hold. The deserts weren't just surviving, they were evolving. But what came next would elevate the conversation from trees and soil to a deeper question. What happens when restoring land also restores lives and futures? Restoring land, restoring lives. As China's deserts slowly transformed into stable ecosystems, the change reached far beyond just sand and plants. It began to reshape the lives of people who once felt abandoned by nature. For millions living in areas like Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, and Xinjiang, the desert was more than a landscape. It was a threat. Now it had become a source of hope, economy, and identity. Farmers who once watched their fields turn to dust were now planting goji berries, grapes, and desert herbs. These crops weren't just surviving, they were thriving in newly restored zones. Local markets emerged, export pipelines were built, eco-farming created fresh jobs and encouraged young people to stay instead of migrating to big cities. Before, the sand buried our homes. Now we're growing futures, said a village elder from Ningxia. Tourism followed. People from across China and abroad traveled to see the blooming deserts. What was once a symbol of failure had become a national pride. Desert parks opened. Visitors hiked stabilized dunes, visited forest corridors, and participated in community planting programs. The once empty stretches of land buzzed with activity. This wasn't manufactured tourism, it was authentic transformation. The health impacts were also profound. Fewer dust storms meant fewer respiratory illnesses. Children grew up with cleaner air, better access to water, and more stable infrastructure. The connection between environment and well-being became clear. "We used to cough all spring," said one school teacher. "Now we take the kids to see the forest." China wasn't just greening deserts, it was healing communities. But for every new root in the ground, there were questions sprouting in the air. If China could do this, reverse decades of damage, why weren't more countries following? The answer wasn't just about politics or money, it was about perception. And that's what began to change next, as China's green miracle entered global consciousness. From punchline to proof, the phrase "burying money in the sand" had once haunted the Great Green Wall. But a decade later, that line was replaced by a different sentiment. They proved us all wrong. Global media outlets that had mocked China's efforts began publishing stories of surprise, respect, even admiration. The transformation wasn't just ecological, it was narrative. China's shift from environmental cautionary tale to global example wasn't sudden. It was slow, visible, and undeniable. One BBC headline read, "Where once there was dust, now there is green." National Geographic featured satellite images showing side-by-side comparisons of the Gobi and Taklamakan borders, once lifeless, now laced with color. The story was now impossible to ignore, and so came the delegations. African nations, Central Asian republics, and even Middle Eastern countries sent teams to observe China's techniques. Workshops were held, field visits organized, translations of China's field manuals and planting techniques spread. Even nations with tense relations with China began to separate politics from planetary interest. "When it comes to fighting deserts, we're all on the same side," said one diplomat. Even international NGOs began reevaluating their tone. The UN Environment Programme and FAO recognized China's desertification reversal efforts as global best practices. The ridicule had ended. In its place was curiosity and cooperation. What was once mocked had become a living model, a manual for reclaiming the future. As the desert stopped advancing and stories of revival spread, another shift began. China's engineers, once busy with digging and planting, found themselves facing a new frontier, not physical but philosophical. What had started as a fight for land had become something far deeper, a lesson about human persistence, harmony, and purpose. A new way of seeing the world. One of the quietest yet most powerful changes brought by the Great Green Wall was psychological. It forced a rethinking of what was possible, not just in terms of landscapes, but of mindsets. China didn't just turn deserts green, it turned despair into belief. And belief in the right hands becomes action. Desertification used to be considered permanent, like a scar, something you worked around, not against. But China's success challenged that assumption. People began to ask, if sand can be turned to soil, what else have we given up on too soon? Cities plagued by pollution, rivers drained dry, forests cleared for short-term profit. Perhaps restoration was still within reach. For younger generations, the message landed hard. School programs began showcasing the Great Green Wall as part of environmental education. Students planted trees as part of annual holidays and learned about sustainability not through lectures, but through legacy. We grew up hearing it was too late, one teen said. Now we know that's not true. Philosophers and writers chimed in. Articles and essays began exploring the deeper symbolism of the blooming deserts. Was this about trees, or was it about a civilization realizing its power to change course? A once hopeless land, reclaimed not by dominance but by harmony. In planting roots, one poet wrote, we rediscovered ours. With deserts tamed and minds opened, the final chapter of this story isn't about China alone. It's about the world, because the greatest test of transformation is whether others are willing to follow. And now all eyes are watching to see where the green will go next. U.S. engineers shocked. It wasn't until American engineers walked the dunes themselves that the magnitude of China's achievement truly hit home. In 2020, a delegation of U.S. environmental and civil engineers visited key sites along the Taklamakan and Gobi corridors. Many of them had been skeptical. They'd read the reports, seen the stats, but they assumed it was inflated, political, or isolated. What they found stunned them. Green stretched farther than they expected. The air was clearer, the dust was controlled, and more importantly, the systems worked, not just on paper, but in practice. From sand-fixing straw grids to drip-irrigated desert orchards, every solution had evolved from struggle into structure. This isn't a patch job, one engineer admitted. It's a machine, a living, working ecological machine. They toured experimental desert farms where villagers cultivated drought-resistant crops using solar-powered irrigation. They examined satellite command centers where vegetation zones were tracked in real time. They saw restored wetlands, reintroduced wildlife, and once abandoned towns repopulated by eco-entrepreneurs. It was a future they hadn't imagined, and it was already working in the present. The biggest shock came not from what they saw, but what they felt. A kind of humility. These were experts who had dismissed the idea, who had once used China's early failures in university lectures as cautionary tales. Now they were writing new papers on how to bring these strategies home. One U.S. official said quietly, they buried straw in the sand, and we buried our expectations. We were wrong. From ridicule to reverence, China's fight against desertification has rewritten what the world thought was possible. The Great Green Wall didn't just stop the sands, it sparked a global conversation about vision, resilience, and what we owe the planet. U.S. engineers once doubted it. Now they're learning from it, and as more nations look to the deserts for solutions, one truth becomes clear. It's never too late to reverse damage. You just have to start. What do you think? Could your country learn from China's green gamble? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter.